we are counting down to that big tariff announcement coming out of Washington tomorrow. Donald Trump will speak in the afternoon, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Let's bring in Bill Robson on this from the C.D. Howe Institute. There's a lot to talk about. Bill, thanks for your time.
Pleasure to be here, but Trump tariffs and the GST, that's a tough combination of topics.
It's a tough combination and has been for a while. So we want to talk about federal and provincial taxes, which we know get levied on goods brought into Canada. And you say Trump's actually targeting that system. What problem do you see with a tariff response to the tax system?
Well, we can always hope that that's not part of the mix, but from what they've been saying, it sounds like it would be. And the rhetoric of the Trump administration on this it's typically been focused on Europe. They'll say, for example, that a U.S. car that goes into the EU will pay VAT of value-added tax of, say, 20%, depends on the destination. And then European cars coming into the United States, there's no value-added tax. That's true, but it's irrelevant. I mean, when California sends something to Oregon where there's no sales tax, California has a sales tax, but that export to Oregon pays no sales tax. So if Oregon sends to California, there's a sales tax in California. Like, all sales taxes work that way. So just right off the bat, this is a very weird thing for them to be targeting. Very hard for us to respond. And so if they do that, it takes us into this very weird world where all of a sudden they're claiming to what you said, that other countries' tax regimes are somehow an appropriate target of U.S. tariffs. So
if essentially he's raising prices on imports, why does it matter that he does it through a tariff versus an actual sales tax? If they did introduce some sort of federal sales tax in the U.S., why would that be a better option?
Well, the United States, it's not for me to make their tax policy, but the direction that Donald Trump is driving it is pretty destructive, because tariffs they're sort of like sales taxes in a way. But they fall very heavily on some things and not at all heavily on others. And the problem with any kind of a sales tax that isn't a value-added tax, so this is true of the state taxes that I mentioned earlier, is anytime something changes hands, the tax gets baked into it. A tariff, every time something crosses a border, the tax gets baked into it. And one of the things that means is that when the United States exports things that have the cost of tariffs baked into them, and we've got steel and aluminum as a very prominent example right now, that actually makes their exports less competitive. One of the reasons that we in Canada and other countries have gone to value-added taxes is because it means that you don't tax the exports on their way out. The receiving jurisdiction gets to tax them. The trouble is that communicating this to Donald Trump and his administration would be very difficult for a bunch of reasons, including that there isn't a federal sales tax in the United States. So you're just starting from that point of reference where your thoughts about how the economy works are different and the taxes that you actually are dealing with are different.
So based on the approach, if it is in fact sort of the federal tax, the value-added tax, that is a target, which countries do you think are going to get hit the hardest tomorrow?
The countries with high value-added tax rates are going to be in the crosshairs here, so that would be the European countries. Canada, though, if we're in the crosshairs also, then we would presumably see, we don't know how they're going to be setting these tariffs, but if they have country-specific rates, presumably the GST, maybe some of the provincial HSTs are factored into it, although, it's a bit like as in the EU, the tax rates vary from place to place, so I don't know how granular they're going to try and get. It's a bit of a mug's game. But the key point that I would make about this is that if they decide that they're going to use tariffs against basic elements of our tax regime like that, I think it takes us into a different world from the one we've been talking about with retaliatory tariffs and maybe some temporary things to fight the trade war, like handouts to businesses to fight the trade war, because this is a battle on a much more fundamental level. And in fact, if I'm thinking about Canada's trade policy options and the things that we ought to be doing to make ourselves more competitive, I'd actually be saying we should be relying more heavily on the GST and less heavily on corporate and personal income taxes. So I'm kind of hoping if Donald Trump attacks the GST, maybe that'll make Canadians like it a little better, because it's actually a pretty good tax and certainly not something they ought to be trying to make us undo.
You touched a little on this, and again, we don't know what to expect, but are you thinking there could be some carve-outs for what could be an across-the-board tariff, but the auto sector, for example, which we know is very vulnerable, could be carved out?
It's very difficult, as Donald Trump no doubt deliberately makes it, to predict what he's going to do. Right now, a lot of the dynamic of this trade war has been, and certainly in Canadian eyes, sort of us versus them, government to government. But inside the United States, there is a lot of discontent building over the economic uncertainty that President Trump has created with a whole lot of the things that he's doing, and about the trade war particularly. If he has across-the-board levies of any size without carve-outs, we will see auto plants close down. We will see very big increases in some consumer prices in the United States. So there's going to be enormous pushback. So I am in the camp that says I don't see across the board tariffs that are very high persisting for very long. But when you're coming at it in as transactional a way as he is, and when you've talked yourself into this mindset where other countries' tax regimes, let alone their trade policies, are legitimate targets, in the short run, I think we're in for some heavy weather.
So that being said, on the flip side, are there sectors that you think are protected in Canada that should be opened up more? We know Donald Trump has lamented about both dairy and lumber in Canada.
Well, lumber is one where you can really argue the pros and cons of it either way. But in that sector, I would just point out, the U.S. imports a lot of lumber from us. When anything raises the price of a house, that's going to be politically contentious. We've suffered a lot of blows on that front, but it's not an area where I would expect things to get dramatically worse. When it comes to our own protectionism and things that the United States is going after, I think supply management is an appropriate target. We have very high tariffs there and very low amounts that you're allowed to import before you hit those. And it's really a self-inflicted wound. It's amazing if you go back decades before the supply management system existed to see that cheese was Canada's second most valuable export after lumber. It's amazing that we had such a competitive industry, and we've really crippled it with supply management. So in the short run, the U.S. would mark that as a trade win. In the long run, they might say, hey, we just created a more vigorous competitor. There are trade concessions we should make, but we should draw the line at the tax system. There's no way that the U.S. gets to tell us how to tax ourselves.
Got it. Bill Robson is the president and